The boomtown of Blackwater Junction rose the way fever came, fast, ugly, and impossible to ignore. One week it was tents and mud ruts. The next it was plank sidewalks and storefronts leaning like drunks toward the wind. Horses stamped in the dust, wagon wheels ground grit into every doorway, and men spoke loud because silence made room for fear. Ezekiel kept the day's paper alive in the front room of the newspaper office, though office was a generous word. It was a narrow building with ink-stained shelves, a press that had been patched more times than it had been replaced, and a window that never quite kept out the cold. The press creaked when the gears turned, as if complaining about the whole venture. Ezekiel did not blame it. Everything here creaked. He was careful with words because words were currency. In Blackwater Junction, the law traveled slower than rumor. A well-placed line in the paper could ruin a man's trade, bless a man's voting rights, or make a marshal decide to look the other way for a week. Ezekiel knew that. He also knew he was not as clean as his job tried to make him sound. He wrote what sold and what kept him breathing. That morning, the air had the sharpness of early frost. By noon, the sun would try to warm the boardwalks, but the nights in this part of the country still bit like teeth. Ezekiel had just finished setting type for a column of local notices when a commotion cracked outside. There was shouting, hard voices, the kind that did not ask questions. Ezekiel frowned and stepped to the front window. Mud churned near the hitching rail. A wagon had broken down, and men were already turning the trouble into a fight. But the shouting shifted, and for a moment Ezekiel heard it clearly. Someone had been thrown from a saddle. Then a different sound, hooves skidding, followed by a heavy, desperate thud. Ezekiel felt the old instinct rise in him, the one that made him check the door latch twice. He had learned to mind his own business because business here minded you back. Still, the voices turned toward his street. One of the men yelled, "He's here! By the paper!" Ezekiel pushed outside before the crowd could decide he belonged to the mess. A man in a patched hat stood with his hands up like he was pleading innocence. Behind him lay a figure in the mud, half-turned, one arm splayed at an angle that made Ezekiel's stomach tighten. The attacker's horse had skidded in a wide arc. The ground was scraped where boots had dragged something that did not want to be dragged. Ezekiel saw blood before he saw faces. Blood always announced itself like a siren, bright against dull earth. The victim's chest rose and fell shallowly. His coat was torn. A strip of leather from a harness lay near his shoulder, as if someone had tried to remove the man's own life from his body piece by piece. Ezekiel's breath came short. He recognized the man, not by name, not by any polite introduction from the saloon, but by a familiar curve of jaw and a previous headline he'd written. This was a contractor who'd been in the paper's good graces yesterday. Ezekiel remembered because the man had paid in coin for a favorable notice about new improvements to a road. Now the road had swallowed him. "You!" one of the shouters barked at Ezekiel, pointing with a thick-fingered hand. "Get the office man to do something. He can't just bleed in the street." Ezekiel's first thought was that they would decide he should pay. His second thought was that the victim looked too cold too fast. He crossed to the fallen man and knelt. He pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck and felt a faint pulse like a reluctant knock at a door. Then he lifted the other man's head enough to see the wound. It wasn't a simple cut. The blade or blunt tool had cracked flesh and reached deeper than he liked. "Move back," Ezekiel told him, his voice low and firm, even though his hands wanted to tremble. A few men did as he asked, but some hovered. Their curiosity was hunger. They had come to watch someone else get hurt and decide what they'd do if it happened to them. That was when the Apache woman appeared. She did not come like the townsfolk expected. No dramatic entrance, no show of authority. She came as if she belonged to the street more than the men did, stepping into view with calm certainty. Ezekiel had seen her before, but only in passing. A traveler at the edge of town, someone the merchants called too quiet. Someone the rougher men avoided because avoidance was easier than trouble. Her presence made the shouting soften. Even before Ezekiel noticed details, he noticed the crowd's posture changing, shoulders turning away, voices lowering as if the air itself carried warning. The Apache woman crouched near the victim without asking permission. She moved with deliberate economy, eyes taking in blood, dirt, the way the wound had been made. She looked older than 29 would normally feel, but not with age, more with the weight of roads that did not care about birthdays. Ezekiel watched her hands. They were steady, not gloved, with faint marks on the knuckles and a strip of cloth tied around the wrist. She pulled a small pouch from her belt and set it down on the boardwalk boards. "What are you doing?" a man demanded, as if she owed him explanations. The Apache woman glanced toward him, and her gaze was not angry. It was patient in the way a storm might be patient before it arrived. "Keeping him warm," she said. Ezekiel felt the irony. She had only just arrived, and already the town had tried to claim ownership of what she did. He swallowed. "Do you know how bad it is?" The Apache woman looked at the wound. "Bad enough he should not be outside anymore." She paused, then added, "Bad enough you shouldn't ask permission." The men shifted. Ezekiel could tell they wanted to argue, but something in her voice made argument feel like a waste of breath. Ezekiel stood and motioned. "Bring him inside." "Inside?" the pointing man echoed. "This man's blood." Ezekiel cut him off. "Inside, or you can stand out here and explain to his family why you watched him die in the street." The town did not talk about family much when it came to men like this contractor. Still, Ezekiel's words found a nerve. People feared to be the ones remembered for letting someone die. The Apache woman rose and guided the victim's weight with a careful strength. Ezekiel helped, lifting a shoulder while she took the legs. The body was heavier than it should have been for someone still breathing. Ezekiel felt heat draining from the man as they moved, like the street had already started its claim. Inside the newspaper office, Ezekiel cleared a corner table. He laid out clean cloth from a cabinet he used for mending paper scraps. He hated that the office already smelled like ink. He wished there were a separate place for healing, a place where blood and ink didn't share the same air. The Apache woman took charge without announcing it. She wet cloth with water from a jug, pressed it against the wound, then removed it quickly, checking and adjusting. The victim's mouth opened in a soundless gasp. His eyes fluttered. "Easy," Ezekiel said, though he wasn't sure who he was comforting. The Apache woman's focus did not break. "He needs heat and rest. The cut is not the only thing. He was struck where the breath has to fight to live." Ezekiel's throat tightened. "Can you stop it?" She looked up at him finally. Her eyes were dark, steady, and not soft. Softness cost something out on the frontier. "I can try. That is all your world ever does. Try." Ezekiel felt a strange flare of irritation, not at her, but at the shape of her words. Everyone here pretended they knew the future. She sounded like someone who had learned the hard way that future was a lie people used to sleep at night. While she worked, Ezekiel watched. He had written about wars and skirmishes for years, had printed notices about raids and punishments. He had seen men with wounds dragged through the street, but he had never seen someone treat a wound like it was a living problem that required respect. The Apache woman cleaned the cut until it was less a wound and more a place that would have to become something else. She tied cloth snugly. She fed the victim small sips of water. She made sure his body stayed warm enough that the blood did not decide to stop fighting. Hours passed in a slow, miserable stretch. Outside, Blackwater Junction carried on without apology. A cart rattled. Someone laughed too loudly. A wagon backfired like thunder. Ezekiel knew the sound of a town refusing to mourn. He sat on a chair that had once belonged to someone else, listening to the victim's breathing change. It wasn't better yet, but it was more regular. Finally, the Apache woman paused and wiped her hands on cloth. Sweat shone at her temple, and she didn't look proud of surviving her own effort. She looked tired in the way people got tired when they did the right thing despite knowing it might cost them. Ezekiel exhaled. "He's still alive." The Apache woman nodded once. "For now." "For now," Ezekiel repeated, because he could not let himself believe in miracles. The victim stirred. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused, searching. "Where?" he rasped. Ezekiel leaned in. "You're in the newspaper office. You're safe." The Apache woman gave a quiet, sharp look at Ezekiel. Ezekiel understood then what she meant. Safe was a promise townspeople broke all the time. The victim swallowed. "The marshal said—" He coughed, and the cough rattled loose pain into his chest. "They said I owed." Ezekiel tensed. Owing was a word this town used when it wanted an excuse for violence. "Who did this?" The Apache woman's gaze moved toward the window, as if she could see the answer in the street dust. The victim tried to sit, failed, and flinched. The Apache woman pressed him back down. "Not now." Then to Ezekiel she said, "There are men who don't want the story told. That is why they tried to silence him." Ezekiel's stomach turned. "If you're right, then—" "If I'm right," she cut in, "you have already been noticed." Ezekiel looked at her and felt the ink on his hands suddenly look like it could never wash off. "Me?" She shrugged slightly. "Men who throw someone in the street don't like witnesses, and you were there." Ezekiel thought of the pointing man, the crowd's hungry faces, and the way the men had lowered their voices when she arrived. He wondered if the town had learned to fear her more than it feared law. The victim's eyes tracked between them. "You," he murmured to the Apache woman. "I seen you at the trading post." The Apache woman's mouth tightened. "I helped because he was human, not because I owed him." "Then how—" Ezekiel started. The Apache woman looked at Ezekiel as if she could see the questions stacking behind his teeth. "You want to repay someone." Her voice held no accusation, only observation. "That is the sort of mistake your world teaches you. Repay. As if kindness is a debt you can square with coin." Ezekiel stood, suddenly restless. "If you think I'm trying to make it simple, I think you're trying to make it fair." She paused. "Fairness is different from repayment." The victim's breathing eased for a moment. The Apache woman leaned closer to him. "Sleep," she ordered gently, and he obeyed like sleep was a door he wanted to open. After a while, silence filled the room except for the small movements of living bodies trying to rest. Ezekiel realized his hands were clenched around the edge of the chair. The Apache woman sat opposite him, smoothing the cloth on her knee. She looked down at her own hands as if they were evidence. "Why are you here?" Ezekiel asked. "In Blackwater Junction." Her eyes lifted. "Because your town has a need." "My town?" Ezekiel echoed. She studied him, and he saw something like weariness turn to a kind of decision. "Your paper is posted on the walls. Your notices travel faster than men do. The words you print reach those who can't read and those who refuse to learn." Ezekiel frowned. "And?" "And," she said, "your paper also carries contracts, deeds, legal claims disguised as news." Ezekiel felt the room tilt. He had seen contracts in the legal notices column. He had printed them because it kept the press fed. He had never asked too much about their origins because asking invited trouble. The Apache woman continued, "I needed to understand which claims were moving and which were lying. Your office is where the lies are born." Ezekiel's pulse sped. "Are you accusing me?" She didn't deny it. "I am warning you." "For what?" "For the day you decide you have no choice." Her gaze flicked toward the victim. "That day came for him today." Ezekiel stared at the Apache woman and tried to sort his fear into something useful. His job was to print. His job was not to investigate who paid who to hurt men in the street. He had one thought that felt like shame. If she knew the paper's power, then she also knew she had placed herself directly in the way of danger by nursing him in that very office. The Apache woman sensed his thoughts. "You think I didn't consider the risk?" Ezekiel swallowed. "Did you?" "Every time I help," she said quietly, "I consider the risk. If I waited for risk to vanish, I'd be dead long before I needed to be brave." Ezekiel looked away. The stove's coals glowed dull red. The room smelled like boiled water, herbs crushed between fingers, and ink. He was used to ink. He was not used to the smell of someone trying to save another person. The next part came with a suddenness that made Ezekiel's skin prickle. Outside, the distant murmur of voices sharpened into a near shout. Footsteps pounded the boardwalk. Someone tried the office door handle. Ezekiel stood. "They won't get in." The Apache woman's hand moved quickly, reaching into a pouch at her belt. She didn't pull a gun. She pulled a small bundle of folded cloth and pressed it into Ezekiel's palm. "Hold this," she instructed. Ezekiel stared at the bundle. It was heavier than cloth alone should be. He looked closer. A few edges of paper peeped from the fabric. "What is it?" he asked. "A proof," she said. "For you, or against you, depending on what you choose next." He didn't have time to ask more. The door rattled again, stronger this time. A voice barked, "Open up! Marshall wants to speak to the editor!" Ezekiel felt the word editor hit him like a slap. It made him realize how visible he was, how replaceable. A man bled in his street, and suddenly the marshal cared about him. He forced himself to keep his voice steady. "Go away!" A different voice, lower and rougher, answered, "You don't tell the marshal what to do." The Apache woman rose with quiet control. "He is not here for you," she said. "He is here for what your press prints." Ezekiel's throat went dry. "You said it was lies." "It's worse than lies," she replied. "It is paper used like a noose." The door splintered with a shove. Ezekiel stepped to block the entryway, heart hammering. He didn't have a weapon besides his stubbornness and a half-empty inkwell. He had always believed his words could protect him. Now he saw the limit. Two men burst inside with the swagger of certainty. The lead man wore a badge Ezekiel recognized from previous weeks. No star on the belt, but the marshal's men looked similar when they wanted to intimidate. They saw the victim on the table, the Apache woman standing near him, Ezekiel blocking the doorway. The lead man smirked. "Well, well, this town's editor plays nurse now." Ezekiel squared his shoulders. "He was hurt. She helped." The man's eyes narrowed, landing on the Apache woman. His gaze lingered in a way Ezekiel hated. "Marshall heard you've been seeing Apache troublemakers." The Apache woman's expression stayed level. "I'm not trouble. Trouble is what you bring." The lead man took one step toward her, close enough Ezekiel could smell cheap tobacco and wool. "We're going to talk." Ezekiel's pulse surged. "You're not talking to her, you're talking to me." The Apache woman's voice stayed calm. "Don't fight men with badges by trying to out-stubborn them." Ezekiel's mind raced. How could he protect her? How could he protect himself? The lead man reached for the victim's table, grabbing at the bundle of cloth tied to the wound, clearly intending to disrupt the healing. Ezekiel moved then, fast and furious, pushing the man's arm away. The man's smirk vanished. "You think you're brave." Ezekiel knew how this would end if he kept pushing, with another kind of wound, one that didn't bleed as much but stayed forever in his mind. The Apache woman stepped in before Ezekiel could lose control. She spoke in a voice that carried over the room's noise like a bell. "If you touch him again, you'll answer for it. Not to the marshal, to whoever you owe." The lead man blinked. "What do you mean?" The Apache woman angled her chin toward Ezekiel. "He has the papers. You already lost." Ezekiel realized then that she had given him the bundle for a reason. His fingers tightened around it as if he could merge with the evidence. The lead man looked between Ezekiel and the bundle with sudden greed. "Hand that over." Ezekiel hesitated. For a moment he saw his choices like two roads. One road where he complied and survived, and another road where he refused and became a target. He thought of the victim's blood. He thought of the Apache woman's hands pressing cloth to flesh, as if her life had already been paid for in full. And he thought of repayment, the idea that gratitude could be settled like a bill. He knew now it wasn't about coin. It was about action. He lifted the bundle slightly. "You don't get it." The lead man took a step. "Editor, you're out of your league." Ezekiel's voice came out rougher than he intended. "My league is the truth." The Apache woman's gaze met his, and her eyes sharpened with something that might have been approval or might have been relief. He couldn't tell. The lead man lunged. Ezekiel pushed backward, keeping the doorway as a barrier. The second man stepped in to help, and suddenly the room became a cramped battlefield of bodies and anger. Ezekiel managed to kick a chair aside, forcing the men to stumble. In the chaos, the Apache woman moved, not to fight, but to protect the victim. She reached for the stove poker and used it to shove a blanket over the wound table, hiding the details they might have used as leverage. The fight didn't last long. It didn't need to. The marshal's men were more used to threatening than to handling resistance from someone with nerve. When they regained control, one man swore and stepped back. "This isn't over." Ezekiel straightened slowly, chest tight, eyes burning from strain. "Leave." The lead man spat on the floor. "The marshal will decide what happens to you." As they dragged themselves out of the office, Ezekiel felt his legs trembling. He had always believed he could handle the town's cruelty with words. Now he understood that words were only one kind of shield, and they were being punched. Silence returned like a bruise. The Apache woman moved to the table and checked the victim's bandaging. Her hands were gentle now, the way they had been before the intrusion. Ezekiel watched her and felt his own anger turn into something heavier. "Why did you think giving me that bundle would help?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She wrapped a final strip, then looked up. "Because you have something I don't." "What?" "You can read what they wrote," she said. "You can make the words travel in the opposite direction." Ezekiel stared at her. "I'm not a saint." "No," she agreed, "but you can become something else for a little while." Her honesty struck him like the cold when you step outside after a warm day. It hurt, but it was clear. Ezekiel carried the bundle to the desk. He unfolded cloth carefully. Inside were papers, deeds and legal notices, original documents with signatures and stamps. The names meant less than the structure, dates, land descriptions, and the kind of phrasing that made injustice look like procedure. He understood enough to see the pattern. The paper column wasn't just reporting, it was transferring land. It was turning real people's histories into claims someone else could purchase with coin and ink. He swallowed hard. "These are for the Apache woman's land." The Apache woman's jaw tightened. "They were for my people." Ezekiel's mind flashed with images from previous issues of his paper. Squatters moved, boundaries clarified, land disputes resolved. He remembered how easily he'd printed those lines. He remembered the way the town cheered for progress and did not ask progress for mercy. He looked up at her. "So you were hurt because you were going to expose them?" She didn't deny it. "I tried to stop a man from signing away a place that kept his children alive." Ezekiel's throat tightened. "And he was attacked?" "Yes," she said, eyes dark. "He was a witness. They wanted him silent." Ezekiel felt sick. His paper had been the loudest mouth in the town. His hands had fed ink to the mechanism that hurt people. He wanted to protest, to claim ignorance, to demand fairness. But fairness had already been denied. He could not keep his hands clean by pretending the grime wasn't there. "I can print a correction," he said, though the word correction sounded like a joke. "I can print the truth." The Apache woman shook her head slightly. "Truth doesn't always win by being printed." "What wins, then?" Ezekiel demanded, and his voice carried anger now, not at her, but at the universe. She stepped closer. Her presence filled the small office. "Survival wins until it doesn't." Ezekiel's gaze dropped to her wrists, to the faint marks, to the way her body held tension even at rest. He realized she had been surviving longer than he had been pretending to. "I nursed him," Ezekiel said slowly. "How do I repay you?" The Apache woman looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether his question was honest or performative. Then she said, "Stop thinking of repayment as coin." She paused. "Think of it as risk. Think of it as what you can lose without asking permission." Ezekiel's hands tightened on the papers. "What do you want me to do?" She looked toward the window. Outside, the boardwalk lights cast thin shadows. The night would come, and with it, men with bad intentions. "Tonight you write the story," she said. "Not the legal notices. A real story, the kind your press doesn't want to tell." Ezekiel hesitated. "If I print that, the marshal will decide you are a problem," she finished. "That is the point." Ezekiel stared at her. Her courage was not pretty. It was practical and earned. He could not mock it. He glanced at the victim, now breathing more smoothly but still too weak to sit. "And him?" "The paper attacked him," she said. "Now he will need a different kind of protection." Ezekiel's mind turned. He could keep the victim in the office. He could hide him at night. He could, but the town was watching. The town loved stories even when those stories hurt. As if reading his thoughts, the Apache woman said, "You can hide a body. It's harder to hide a rumor." Ezekiel looked back at the papers. He wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to be better. But he feared becoming reckless, the kind of man who believed heroism erased consequences. He took a breath and began to work. He set type for a new front-page column. He wrote about the assault without romanticizing it. He wrote about the legal deception with plain language that made the injustice easy to understand. He wrote about the Apache woman's nursing, not as gossip, but as human proof that cruelty had patterns and mercy had names. He did not write her name. He did not know if that was safety or insult. He chose safety. He chose to let the story point toward the larger theft, rather than place her under a spotlight. He worked by lamplight until the keys of the press felt warm under his palm. The ink smell deepened, and Ezekiel realized he was holding his breath as he composed. His mind replayed the marshal's men in his office, the way they had reached for the wounded man. If he printed this, he would become a target. If he didn't, he would become complicit. He finished the last line just as the night settled. Outside, the boomtown grew louder with every hour, as if the dark brought out more hunger. The Apache woman watched him with a quiet steadiness that unsettled him. "You did it," she said. "I wrote it," Ezekiel corrected. "Printed it. When the press moves, it becomes official." She nodded once, approving in a way that didn't feel like flattery. "Official is what they want to control." Ezekiel swallowed. "So what now?" She stepped closer and touched his wrist lightly, not gripping, just anchoring him for a moment. Her fingers were cool from the evening air. "Now," she said, "we keep him alive and we keep you breathing long enough to see morning." Ezekiel looked at her hand on his wrist and felt the oddest thing. Gratitude without sweetness, fear without collapse, hope without certainty. The victim stirred again. His eyes opened wider this time, and his gaze found Ezekiel. "What'd you do?" he rasped. Ezekiel's throat tightened. "I told the truth." The victim's mouth worked as if he wanted to spit a warning. "Truth doesn't get you paid." The Apache woman leaned down. "Truth gets you accounted for." The victim's eyes flicked to her. "Apache. Humans," she corrected softly. Ezekiel felt the conflict inside him. He had written about Apache people like they were either menace or myth. Standing there beside her, watching her speak with dignity, he realized he had been lazy with his humanity. He forced himself to speak gently. "You're going to need to recover. And if anyone comes asking, you say nothing." The victim's lips pressed into a line. "They'll come." Ezekiel didn't argue. "Then we'll be ready." He did not tell the victim that he was not sure what ready looked like. They moved carefully through the night. Ezekiel covered the wound table again and pulled the victim under heavier blankets when shadows passed the window. He turned the signboard in the front door to "closed," even though he knew it was meaningless. The Apache woman made no show of hiding. She moved with purpose, checking doors, listening at cracks. At one point, she asked Ezekiel for water, and his hands shook as he poured it for her. He hated that his hands shook. He hated that she could be steady and he couldn't. Around midnight, the marshal's men returned. They arrived with more confidence this time, less shouting, more searching. Ezekiel heard their boots pause at the door. One voice said, "If he printed it, he can fix it." Ezekiel's heart pounded. "Fix it," he repeated under his breath. The phrase made his stomach turn. They assumed the world could be rewritten by force. The Apache woman's gaze met Ezekiel's. In that silent exchange, she communicated something clear. Do not freeze. Do not let fear choose for you. Ezekiel felt a strange surge of determination. He stepped toward the back of the office, away from the door, and positioned himself near the desk where the press papers sat. When the men came inside, Ezekiel did not reach for a gun because he didn't have one. Instead, he moved to the press, his tool, his power. He lifted a newly printed sheet and held it up so the lamplight could catch the ink. "Read," he told them. The lead man sneered. "We don't read propaganda." Ezekiel's voice hardened. "It isn't propaganda. It's a record." The Apache woman stepped into view behind him, close enough that the men could not pretend she wasn't there. Her stillness made the room feel larger. One of the men hesitated. "That's her," the Apache woman answered without turning her head. "That's your conscience finally waking." The lead man's eyes narrowed. "You're bold for someone without a badge." The Apache woman's smile was thin and tired. "I have survived without badges. You can survive without threats." The men moved to grab Ezekiel, but he held the paper higher. "This will be in mourning hands," he said. "If you take me, the paper stays. If you burn it, others will repeat what they already heard. You can't kill ink." The lead man looked like he wanted to believe in violence as a solution to everything. He looked like he'd built his life on the idea that fear could replace facts. Ezekiel realized then that he might not be able to save himself, but maybe, just maybe, he could save the story. One of the men spat. "We'll see." They left again, angrier and more uncertain. Ezekiel felt his knees threaten to fold. He sank into the chair and pressed his palms to his eyes until sparks danced. When he lowered his hands, the Apache woman was watching him. There was no pity in her gaze. "You did it," she repeated, quieter. "For him." "For all of it," Ezekiel corrected. "For what you said, repayment as risk." She nodded, slow. "Risk is expensive, but you paid." Morning came with pale light and a thin fog rolling along the street. Blackwater Junction woke as if nothing had happened. Doors creaked, coffee boiled, men argued at the rail. But the air was different now. People carried themselves like they already knew a secret. Ezekiel's press sheet had been distributed before sunrise. He had set a boy to take copies to every corner of town. He had paid him with coin he could not afford to lose. By mid-morning, the rumor had become a wave. People gathered in front of the office, reading. Some laughed nervously as if mockery could protect them. Others stood silent, eyes on the lines they recognized too well. The marshal arrived in a hurry, like someone whose control had been stolen in his sleep. He kicked the office door open and strode in, hat low, jaw tight. "You printed lies." Ezekiel stood straighter. He realized his spine had learned something overnight. The Apache woman stood beside him, not behind him, not for protection alone, but for presence. Ezekiel met the marshal's eyes. "I printed records. You can argue the interpretation if you want, but you can't deny the dates." The marshal's gaze slid to the Apache woman. Something like disdain flickered across his face, but it was layered with anger. "You," he said, "you shouldn't be here." The Apache woman answered calmly. "And you shouldn't take what you can't hold with honesty." The marshal's voice sharpened. "Don't speak to me like you're a judge." The Apache woman didn't flinch. "You aren't a judge either. You're a thief with paperwork." The room went still. Even the curious townsmen outside paused their murmuring. Ezekiel felt the danger surge. He saw the marshal's men shift. He saw the marshal's hand move, toward a holster or toward authority, Ezekiel couldn't tell. The victim, now sitting up on a chair Ezekiel had dragged to the corner, spoke with a hoarse clarity that surprised even Ezekiel. "She's right," the contractor rasped. "I saw the signatures. I saw how they made it look clean." The marshal's eyes widened in anger. "You won't talk." The victim coughed and continued, voice cracking but stubborn. "I was hurt for talking." Ezekiel realized then that the victim's survival was not just luck, it was also choice. He had fought through pain because he feared what silence would do to others. The Apache woman's gaze softened for one breath before returning to steel. The marshal stared at Ezekiel as if Ezekiel were the deeper problem. "You're a printer," he snapped. "You don't decide justice." Ezekiel heard his own voice answer before he could overthink it. "I decided to stop lying with ink." For a moment, the marshal looked like he might explode. Then he looked around at the gathering crowd. People were listening. People were reading. People were beginning to understand that the paper didn't just print news, it printed consequences. The marshal tightened his jaw and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll regret this." Ezekiel held the gaze. "Maybe." The Apache woman turned slightly toward Ezekiel. "This is only the first fire," she murmured, so low Ezekiel almost missed it. "They will come again." He swallowed. "Then we survive again." She nodded. "We survive, and we don't pretend it makes us good people. It just makes us alive long enough to choose." Ezekiel found himself staring at her. He had come into that office as a man trying to control words and keep danger at bay. He had ended up learning that control was an illusion. What mattered was what he did when control failed. As days passed, the town's reaction grew harsher and more complicated. Some men praised Ezekiel for his courage. Others threatened him in alleys, promising to fix his press by breaking his hands. A few women brought bread and extra blankets, not because they loved the Apache woman, but because they respected a kindness that didn't ask for approval. The Apache woman did not become softer in the face of cruelty. If anything, she grew more precise. She taught Ezekiel to check doors properly. She made him listen to footsteps. She showed him how to hide papers in plain sight, tucked behind false compartments Ezekiel had never noticed before. At times, Ezekiel resented her competence. He wanted to be useful without being taught. But every time he failed, the resentment cracked into humility. One evening, after a dispute outside the office ended with a man storming away in anger, Ezekiel found the Apache woman cleaning a wound on herself, a small injury from earlier that week. He shouldn't have seen it. He had stumbled into the back room for more cloth and found her bent over her work. Her movement was careful, but the pain in her posture was real. Ezekiel hesitated in the doorway. "You didn't have to." She looked up, eyes steady. "You think I stopped getting hurt because I help others?" "I didn't mean—" She cut him off gently. "You meant you wanted to be the one doing the helping." Ezekiel's cheeks warmed with embarrassment. "Maybe I did." The Apache woman wiped her hands and set cloth aside. "You've helped, not because you're righteous, because you're changed." "Changed," Ezekiel repeated. The word felt strange on his tongue. She nodded slightly. "Before, you used ink to sell safety. Now you use ink to invite danger." "That sounds like a curse," he said. "It is a curse," she replied. "But curses sometimes grow into blessings. Not the sweet kind, the earned kind." Ezekiel stepped closer. "Why are you staying?" Her gaze shifted toward the window. The town's lights flickered beyond the glass. "Because you're still alive," she said. "That's it?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because you treated me like I was human, even when you didn't fully understand me." Ezekiel's throat tightened. He remembered the moment she touched his wrist with that calm steadiness. He remembered the way she had given him the evidence and not demanded he become someone else. He sat on the edge of a crate near her, careful not to crowd. "I don't know how to repay that." The Apache woman's eyes held his. "Then don't. Just keep showing up." He looked down at his hands. Ink stained the cuticles. Scars and burns from honest work lived under the skin. "I'm afraid," he admitted. "Good," she said. "Fear means you understand the stakes." Ezekiel breathed out slowly. "I'm afraid you'll leave." She didn't deny it. Her voice softened by a fraction. "I might." He flinched. "Why would you?" "Because you helped me," she said. "And because helping creates obligation, and obligation draws wolves." Ezekiel looked up. "Wolves like the marshal," Wolves like anyone who profits when people disappear, she answered. Ezekiel swallowed. Then tell me what you need. Tell me what you want. Her expression held a kind of restraint Ezekiel was not sure how to interpret. She looked like someone used to rationing tenderness. Finally, she said, I want my people's land recognized. Ezekiel's mind spun. That would require more than one newspaper column. It required legal battles, witnesses, and likely blood. I can't promise success, he said. I'm not asking you to promise, she replied. I'm asking you to decide you'll be in the room when it matters. Ezekiel nodded slowly. The decision felt heavy but clear. The next turning point came with a storm. Rain turned the street into a mess of churned mud and slick boards. The marshal's threats became actions when a group of men cornered the Apache woman outside a warehouse where Ezekiel had stored extra type and paper stock. Ezekiel heard shouting, then the sudden sound of bodies slamming into crates. He ran. He didn't know what he would find, only that his fear had become motion. By the time he reached the warehouse, the men had forced the Apache woman against a wall. One held a rope in his hands. Another gripped the strap of her satchel like it was contraband. Her head was lifted, chin set, eyes blazing with controlled defiance. Ezekiel stepped into the rain like he could wrestle fate by stepping forward. What do you want? He demanded. The men turned. For a moment, Ezekiel saw their confusion. They expected resistance from the Apache woman, not from the editor. The marshal wants her, one said. Ezekiel's pulse pounded. He kept his voice low and steady. She's done nothing here but work. She's Apache, another man sneered, as if that was a crime by itself. The Apache woman's voice cut through the rain. Your ignorance is loud. The man holding the rope laughed. We'll quiet you. Ezekiel's anger ignited. You'll quiet yourself first, or I'll call every man with a reading lesson in this town to witness what you do. The men hesitated again, because witnesses existed, because ink had already started a new kind of fire. But hesitation was not rescue. It was merely delay. One man moved toward Ezekiel anyway. Ezekiel didn't have a weapon, but he had a sturdy press keychain of iron used for the typesetting table. He grabbed it in mid-stride and swung with whatever strength his body could muster. The man reeled back, cursing. Ezekiel collided with him, knocking him into a stack of crates that toppled with a crash. In that chaotic moment, the Apache woman slipped free, fast and sure, like a person who had escaped worse before. She grabbed the satchel and shoved it into Ezekiel's arms. Run, she said. Ezekiel's breath came hard. With you? With you, she answered. You need the papers. The men scrambled to regroup. Someone shouted for help. Ezekiel felt the stakes slam into him like the first impact of violence. They ran through rain and mud back to the newspaper office. Ezekiel clutched the satchel to his chest. It thudded with weight, and he thought of the evidence inside. Behind them, boots splashed and voices carried rage. They burst into the office. Ezekiel slammed the door shut and threw the bar across. The Apache woman leaned against the wall, breathing hard. She looked furious and frightened all at once. Furious because they had tried to treat her like property, frightened because she knew what people did when they lost control. Ezekiel's voice shook. They were going to rope you. They were going to make a story, she replied. Rope is just a prop. Ezekiel stepped closer. Why do you look at me like that? Her gaze lifted, and for a moment her expression changed, just slightly, just enough to feel like a confession. Because you keep saving me, she said. Ezekiel swallowed. I didn't save you, I just... You did, she insisted. You ran, you fought, you risked your neck for a woman you don't even fully understand. Ezekiel's chest tightened. Then teach me. The Apache woman's eyes widened by a fraction. Teach you what? How to repay, he said, and the words came out clumsy. How to be better without turning you into a symbol, without trying to earn my way into your kindness. Her expression softened, slowly, like dawn breaking after long night. You can't repay what I gave you, she said. Ezekiel's voice broke slightly. Then let me try differently. She moved closer until they were inches apart. Rainwater dripped from her hair and down her jaw. It made her look almost unreal, like a spirit that had learned to bleed and still refused to vanish. "You already tried," she whispered, "when you wrote the story, when you didn't pretend you were innocent." Ezekiel's throat tightened. "I'm not innocent." "I didn't ask for innocence," she replied. "I asked for someone who would stand in the room when the wolves came." Outside, the men pounded the front door. The sound shook the room's bones. Ezekiel flinched. He wanted to look brave. He wanted to pretend fear didn't exist. But fear existed, and he honored it by planning. He grabbed a drawer and pulled out a stack of folded papers. "These are the next ones," he said. "The proof you needed. The story we can force into the open." The Apache woman's eyes tracked the papers. "Good." Ezekiel's pulse raced. "Then what?" She stepped to the window and stared out into the rain-slick street. "Then you publish the land recognition petition. You print the names of witnesses. You print the receipts." Ezekiel swallowed. "And if they kill me?" The Apache woman turned back to him. There was a fierce clarity in her face. "Then someone else reads it and continues. That is how survival works, when you can't survive alone." The door rattled again. Ezekiel felt the bar shift. He made a choice then, not heroic, but honest. "I don't want to die for ink," he said. The Apache woman's gaze held his. "Then live for the people this town pretends are invisible." Ezekiel exhaled, and something inside him unclenched. When the men finally broke through, they didn't find the Apache woman in the doorway. She had moved to the back, into the office's shadowed corner where type stacks provided cover. Ezekiel used the chaos to shove the papers into a hidden compartment behind the press casing, an area he'd never known could be opened. The men swarmed, cursing, grabbing at coats and chairs. Ezekiel's body moved without him fully directing it, pulled by instinct and obligation. The Apache woman emerged again from the back with a cloth-wrapped bundle and shoved it into Ezekiel's hands. "This one is for after," she said. Ezekiel stared. "After what?" "After they try to stop you," she replied. Ezekiel's breath caught. "They're going to try again." She nodded. "They always do." The room throbbed with noise. Ezekiel could hear shouting outside now, more men joining. The boomtown loved escalation. But in the middle of the violence, Ezekiel noticed something. The crowd outside had changed again. After the earlier articles, some townsfolk waited at a distance, unwilling to be seen as accomplices. Others stood close enough to watch. Witnesses mattered now. Ezekiel and the Apache woman faced each other between broken chairs and scattered papers. In a softer voice, Ezekiel asked, "Do you trust me?" The Apache woman's eyes searched his face. "I don't trust easily," she said, "but I trust what you do." Ezekiel stepped toward her, careful not to startle. "Then let me be clear." "What?" He swallowed. "I don't just want to repay you. I want to keep choosing you even if it ruins me." Her breath caught, barely, but he saw it. Her expression turned complicated, as if her heart had been trained to survive without letting itself believe. "You talk like a man who thinks love is a bargain," she said. Ezekiel flinched. "No, She raised her hand and placed her palm against his chest, stopping his words. Her touch was warm now, not cool like earlier, warm from effort, warm from being alive with him. "Love is not a bargain," she said, voice steady. "Love is a decision you keep, even when it becomes expensive." Ezekiel's eyes burned. "Then decide with me." The Apache woman's gaze dropped to his ink-stained hands. "I already did," she whispered. A moment later, the marshal's men dispersed enough for breathing space. Ezekiel didn't know if it was because dawn would make them hesitate or because the town's attention had turned into something too loud to ignore. He only knew they weren't pinned for the moment. Later, when the immediate danger had eased, Ezekiel sat with the Apache woman on the back steps of the newspaper office. The rain had stopped, leaving everything glossy and slick. The air smelled like wet wood and distant smoke. Ezekiel held a cup of coffee that tasted burnt. It was the only hot thing he had, and he offered it to her without thinking. She accepted and held it between her hands like warmth mattered. He watched her drink. "You could have left," he said. The Apache woman looked out toward the street where men were still arguing, still fighting over paper and power. "I wanted to," she admitted. "But I saw you keep showing up. I saw you stop pretending words were harmless." Ezekiel's throat tightened. "I don't know what happens to us." Her mouth tilted slightly, not quite a smile, not quite a warning. "No one knows. That is why it matters." Ezekiel leaned his head back against the wall. His body ached from the night. His mind ached from guilt and fear and something else, something that felt like relief. He turned to her. "Will you stay long enough for me to do something real?" Her eyes met his. "Real like what?" "Like helping you protect your land," he said. "Not by writing a story and walking away, by standing beside you when the story turns into action." The Apache woman's gaze softened, and for a moment her eyes looked less wary. "If you do that," she said, "then I will stay. Not because you earned me, because I choose you." Ezekiel exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. He reached for her hand. His fingers brushed hers, ink staining her palm faintly, and he didn't pull away when she flinched. He instead stayed still, giving her the space to decide. She let her fingers settle into his. In the frontier, romance was never neat. It arrived with blood in the street, with paperwork that could steal a life, with men who hurt because they believed they could. Ezekiel had expected love to be a clean reward for being good. Instead, love had demanded he be honest, demanded he be brave in ways that didn't feel heroic, demanded he stop trying to repay with words alone. The Apache woman squeezed his hand once, small, firm, grounding. Ezekiel looked at her and understood that what they had wasn't a happy ending handed over like a gift. It was a beginning, earned by choosing each other while danger still breathed. Morning would bring more trouble. There would be more threats, more pages, more choices that could break them. But for the first time since Blackwater Junction had swallowed him, Ezekiel believed in a future not because it was guaranteed, but because he had already decided what he would do in it.